Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, in this video, I'd like to talk about something very important in narcissistic recovery, okay, which is the idea of vulnerability. Okay, today I'm going to talk about vulnerability. And this is a big topic when it comes to therapy, because I think most therapists today consider vulnerability to be like the beginning of being a full human being. You know what I mean? Like we walk into human health through the door of vulnerability. Okay, and I just want to be really careful because I think vulnerability can be a problem. Okay. Now, here's the problem with vulnerability. All right. I see vulnerability as a stage that's preliminary to whether we actually engage with the world or not. Okay. In other words, vulnerability is sort of like a pre engaged state um, where we're not, it's sort of like we're talking about almost like, how would I say, vulnerability to me is a passive state. Okay. And so when we talk about vulnerability as the alternative to being over defended, all right, in my opinion, I think over defendedness is also a passive state because we're sort of so shielded from the world that we're not engaged with the world. Okay. But the problem is that just being vulnerable is also not being engaged with the world. Okay. So I think that both vulnerability and being over defended or being blocked, blocking out, basically dealing with the world, I think both vulnerability and over defendedness are both, in my opinion, they're both passive states that are preliminary to us actually courageously engaging in the world. Okay, so if vulnerability just means not being over defended, well, okay, I can see that. I can see that. But let's not make the mistake of stopping at vulnerability. There's still another stage for us, okay, which is getting involved and integrated and, how would you say, getting engaged with the world, okay? So basically, I guess the concern I have when I hear people, oh, you sound so, it's like, oh, it's so nice to hear you being vulnerable. It's like I've arrived, I've arrived. No, you haven't arrived. Vulnerability is just nothing more than just getting over the over defendedness. Okay. But I don't think we should like sit and create vulnerability. I don't think we should regard vulnerability as a destination. Okay, because there's still the next step, which is taking that openness and now having the courage to get engaged with the world. You see what I mean? Because we can be vulnerable and be sort of get over comfortable in that sort of passive place where we're just vulnerable, and then suddenly we just want to celebrate that. Okay, as like a destination, like, hey, I made it, I'm a human being. And it's like, I'm sorry, being human is, yeah, sure, it's nice to take away the armor, it's nice to take away the over defendedness. Okay, but at some point the question is, do we become engaged in the world, and do we become conditioned to be engaged in the world? In the end, we don't just want to be a jellyfish sitting on a couch celebrating vulnerability. In the end, we want to be conditioned like athletes, and not to have extra defenses, but to get courageously engaged with the world. Okay, so the final stage is actually being like an athlete. It's like being an athlete, conditioned and taking on more discomfort and even more pain as a baseline, so that we can be engaged in the true real world, where we do have to take a few bruises, and we do have to maybe have a sportsman-like attitude about maybe taking more pain. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying this as a way of like denying, you know I'm not saying this as a way of denying my vulnerable feelings or whatever. You can have all the feelings you want, but the courageous person, despite all the feelings they have, and I have feelings, believe me, I have a lot of feelings. But the thing is, despite all the feelings and all the insecurities we have, the difference between the courageous person and the protected person is whether you can openly engage in the world. Okay. Now, I do understand there are people who are very over defended and they engage in the world in a way that sort of protects them. You know what I mean? So like you could be engaged in the world in a way that sort of protects like a fake image you have of yourself or whatever. Only deep down in our heart do we know whether we're engaged in the world as a way of managing our ego or managing our self-esteem, or whether we even abandon our self-esteem and just volunteer ourselves fully into the world as an engaging agent. Okay. Where we put the engagement ahead of how we actually feel. Okay. That's a step of courage, And so I do understand the wisdom of starting from a vulnerable place. Okay. But I don't understand maybe the mistake people make, or maybe the misunderstanding, or maybe failure to underline. Maybe psychology could underline a little better that vulnerability is not a last destination. Okay. Because just being vulnerable, I don't see that as anything to celebrate by itself. If you look at it as a stage away from getting away from being over-defended, okay, well, it's a stage, it's a step in the right direction. But eventually, we want to suit up and become, athletes, engaged in the world in a courageous way, where we're not like selectively engaged in the world, but when we're just openly engaged in the world and we're taking on the pain and the discomfort that comes from being engaged in the world, you know. So so yeah, I have a problem, I guess, with the way I think vulnerability is sort of overemphasized as like this like be all and end all of being a great person, when in reality it's just a preliminary to getting engaged in the world. Okay. So I guess, to me, if I'm going to have a poster child of mental health, my poster child is not going to be a jellyfish of vulnerability just sitting in a couch. The poster child for me of mental health is an athlete, literally. Like say symbolically, I'm going to look at my favorite athlete, or maybe a hero from, like, say, the military, or maybe take the military out. That's too politically charged. But maybe like somebody who's been very active in their community, okay, and they have a job and they're also very active and they spend a lot of hours involved in dealing with like family, community, profession. Those to me are the symbols of sort of like the portrait of mental health. So imagine somebody who like works full time as a truck driver. Maybe they have like their own private business. Maybe they have a family. They're really dedicated to the family, and they have time for the community. Maybe baseball coach. Maybe helping with the homeless. Maybe helping provide food to a women's shelter or whatever. Just a broad spectrum of activities and hard work, and also dedicated to their family. And those are people that really take on a lot. And if they're not doing it to feel good about themselves, they're doing it because they know that it's something that needs to be done. So it's not a narcissistic thing where they're filling this sense of themselves being like a great person. You can tell the difference. Some people really just give themselves, get engaged in the world because they want to be an agent for something better. You know what I mean? So, I mean, that would obviously be an extreme example. Everybody has to set their limits of what they can handle, because, if you go too far, you just burn out, So, but at the same time, we should raise our threshold and get engaged in the world at a much higher level than we're at. So the idea is to improve your conditioning, but just set the learning curve so you don't burn out on the way. But I think we should all strive to be tougher, not in that macho sense, but in the sense that we can be more weather beaten by just exposing ourselves to the storms of the world, getting engaged, going in steps, but just sort of building that thick skin and just the toughness, the toughness that's not over defended, but the toughness of just being in the world and being able to take the bruises as like sportsmanship, as a sportsman, And life is kind of tough. And if we can take a few bruises and take some pain and sort of take the conditioning of being uncomfortable as a baseline, okay, I think that right there is what we do with our vulnerable self. The vulnerable self is not a destination. It's just a step. It's just a step along the way. Stop along the way. So yeah, I have a problem with vulnerability also, because I think there's this idea that being vulnerable is almost like is like to be celebrated, and so at that point you don't have to take any more responsibility as to like what could be the consequences of maybe being vulnerable. And I think, in all honesty, like we all have to see we all have vulnerabilities. Like even though I have NPD, I was a how would you say, I was a chump. I was really easily, like, too easily fall in love with people. I would too easily get into relationships. I would idealize friendships. I would be too easily. I was really unstable going from job to job, and not being a little more careful in selecting like where I was going to be working or whatever. And so I was kind of like I was like a real sucker, for people like things that seem too good to be true. Maybe believing in things too easily, relationships, people, whatever. And so, that was my vulnerability, being a little bit gullible, being a little bit naive, a little immature, a little too easily, getting associated with people a little too easily, too quickly, I mean, that's just immaturity, right? I mean, but that's a vulnerability that I at some point I either have to face that, or I'm going to over and over again, I'm going to have problems, So vulnerability can actually be a problem, you know and we should all know, we should all have the courage to examine our vulnerabilities, not as like trophies on the wall, but as like places where we could potentially end up in trouble. And the idea is not to get over defended, but the idea is just to know yourself, okay, and then to get engaged in the world, okay, and actually get out there in the world, in the real world, and sort of develop our muscle, develop our thicker skin, and also become weather beaten. The weather beating, that's part of developing the full human spirit. you know um, we can't live lives too comfortable, but we have to understand our vulnerabilities, because as we go out in the world, okay, the real world, our vulnerabilities can end up as opportunities for other people to end up hurting us, or by accident. It doesn't even have to be intentional. So, I mean, we have to be aware of our vulnerabilities. And in my case, I idealized people too easily. I fell in love too easily. Well, at some point I had to grow up. I had to maybe take a break from that kind of easy attachment to people. And I had to just sort of maybe slowly rebuild a stronger version of myself, not an over defended version of myself, but just a stronger, more weather beaten, more experienced version of myself. And that took years. Everything good takes years, but just like if you practice for years, you could be a starting quarterback, you could be a starting football player, or whatever. Same thing, if we just get out in the world and get engaged slowly, we become almost like athletes. We become conditioned, and we may actually be able to address some of our vulnerabilities and get over them, and grow from them, So yeah, I mean, if we're over defended, if we're blocked, whatever, I mean, yeah, vulnerability is like letting go of the defenses. That's an important step along the way, for sure. But I don't think we need to enshrine that as like a final destination or some big thing to celebrate. I think the next step is getting engaged in the world. And I think that's where we have to, be aware of our vulnerabilities, and maybe take a break from indulging those vulnerabilities, and then maybe just get in the world and sort of get beaten up a little bit. I mean, within everything, within moderation, right? We're not going to go out there and just get abused. We're not going to go out there and overdo it. Everything in steps. It's just like at the gym. You go in little steps, but the goal is to get more engaged with the world, more weather beaten, weather worn, and just develop sort of more of a baseline of being able to carry more discomfort in life. Okay. Because that will open up, I believe, a broader metabolic process in the mind and the body. Okay. Because I think without a certain amount of discomfort, I don't think we can have stability in our metabolic organism. I really think that a baseline of discomfort and frustration, I really think that not just for the sake of pain, but because we're engaged in the world, I think that will develop our overall metabolic wholeness as a psychological and physical being. I believe that. So yeah. So I guess the final message here is, I'm not against vulnerability. I'm just very uncomfortable with looking at vulnerability as like a destination and something to be celebrated. I think it's a good thing as a step along the way. But the real end goal that we're all looking at, I hopefully, is not to be retreating in our private, comfortable worlds, but to be extended and engaged in the real world, taking on the pain, trading the pain to be engaged. Okay, so that we have a more painful, more uncomfortable baseline, but we actually rise to it and we become conditioned to it. And I think that will broaden our overall metabolic depth as people. And I think that will give us more stability and more wisdom and solidness in the world. Also make us more diplomatic and more flexible, so we can actually play the contact sport of life, and live a real life as a real human in the real world as a mature person. So that's pretty much my position on vulnerability. I think it's a nice destination along the way. I mean, it's a nice stop along the way, but it's not really the destination. Yeah, my best. Sorry about those dogs. But yeah, so thanks for watching, and wishing everybody the best.